Hey everyone. All right, so today I'm going to talk a little bit about collaboration and why it's hard. Now, obviously, sometimes it's not hard, sometimes it's easy, sometimes it's magic, and some of that has to do with you just find the right person, the right project, you just go, and that's great. But even when it starts out that way, sometimes later in the process, in fact, in my experience, very often, there are moments where it's difficult. It's just one of those things, and I thought it might be an interesting thing to talk about a little bit today. So, setting aside, those situations where you just find the perfect collaborator, I was thinking a little bit first about how do you know when you're collaborating with the right person? And my thought about it is that you definitely don't want it to be too hard, right? You don't want it to be something where the visions are so different that you can't get anything done. And that's pretty obvious. And I think a lot of people just, self select themselves into the right situations that way. But I think the other thing is that you also don't want it to be too easy. And what I mean is that part of what's really interesting about working with other people is that they don't see everything exactly your way. Or, even more importantly, that they don't necessarily just go along with everything your way, right? In other words, you want somebody who's going to bring a vision to the table that's going to challenge you a little bit, and that's also going to let you know that. They're not going to bring it and just go away and grumble. And of course, the same thing is on you, right? To speak up about what's important to you, but to also be receptive. And one of the most important things that I've learned about that is that you have to try things out to know whether or not you actually like them or dislike them. In other words, there's a lot of arguments that people get into about whether something is or isn't a good idea that are completely and utterly pointless, right? Because, you know, you're sure you don't want to hear, an alto saxophone solo on this song, but one way to find out is to actually hear one. And in my experience, I have just been utterly shocked at the number of times that I've discovered that I was wrong by actually hearing something in practice. And it's not always that I'm completely wrong. In other words, maybe there's a reason I didn't want to go in this direction or that direction, but I realize that my reasoning was a little bit too restrictive. That, in other words, oh, there is a way to do the thing that I want to do, but to also incorporate this other idea, right? And I find out by actually trying it and actually hearing it that it's the right direction to go in. So that's where collaborating with someone that's not super easy can really turn into something great because you have this opportunity to try out all these different ideas. Okay, it also occurred to me that there are two different kinds of collaboration. Obviously, there's a lot more. There's going to be a continuum they exist along. But just to keep it simple, one I'm calling sandboxed and the other one that I'm calling 360. And sandboxed in this case, means I want a female voice on this track that I'm working on, and I'm not a female voice, right? Or I'm not an alto saxophone player, or whatever it is, and you need that person to come in. And then there are typically two general approaches. One is, the part is written, the words are written, the whole thing is sketched out, and you really just need a session player to come in and do it. And while that kind of relationship has collaborative aspects, ideally, like you want that person to be bringing their full creative self to the process, you're also putting some real limitations on it. What's also very common, though, is you want, the sound of this instrument or that instrument, but the part isn't entirely worked out, and you're bringing somebody in to create something with you. And in some situations, this is a really ideal form of collaboration for a lot of people because you're not getting into some of the muck that I was starting to talk about a little bit in the last session, where you're really able to differ on the vision, right? In other words, you bring that person in to play a part, and maybe they start out saying, I think this sounds great, I think this sounds great. And what do? Your job is just to go, great, and record it, right? Because then you also have that opportunity to say, let's try it this way, let's try it that way. But the same thing applies. If you want somebody to come in and create something, you have to not be too hard on their ideas. You have to let them try them out. You have to listen, right? And then you also have to push for the things that you want, getting the performance that you want. And I just think a big part in those situations of getting the part and the performance that you want is still allowing there to be a real give and take within that sandbox, right? So you say you're collaborating for this much of the song, but I really want to hear what you have to do. And then later on, you're going to have that opportunity to pick takes, or even have them come back if you realize that you've discovered really what the ideal idea is, but you didn't totally get it, and so on. The 360-degree collaboration, where you're really going in and saying, I've got an idea for a song, or I've got an idea that we should produce this song you've written this way or that way, that's where things get really interesting, right? Because that's where you may find that you have a clash of visions, which is a problem that in my experience, like I said, you can only work out through, it's sort of more perspiration than inspiration, trying things out, sitting with them, not reacting too fast, right? Not being overly negative or not being like fake positive, just taking the time to figure it out. And of course, that's very personally challenging for us, because not only do we feel strongly about our creative visions, but we also have a whole lot of other stuff, psychological stuff, emotional stuff, personal stuff that has nothing to do with making the music or the movie. These ideas about, hey, what's it going to say about me if it sounds this way? Because that's not really my style. There's all this other stuff that you got to be really circumspect about, because it might be a load of crap, or it might be 90% crap, right? And what you don't want to be doing is putting a whole lot of that crap on the other person to deal with. And if you're not sure in a new collaborative relationship, if that you really want that 360-degree collaboration, starting out with things that are sandboxed is a really good way to go. Because if you do really bump heads and feelings get hurt by doing something because you said yes, right, or you were more open than you really wanted to be, that's actually a lot harder to fix than it is to just not do it in the first place, and then really decide, okay, where's my boundary? Where do I want this to go? So this next bit is really hard, but really important, especially when you're into the deeper sorts of collaborations. And that's the concept of compromise versus consensus, right? One of the reasons it's very important to try things out and to take some time and really figure out where you stand on different creative ideas is that it's very, very easy to slip into compromise. In other words, I'm not super crazy about this thing you're bringing to the table, but we're going to do it. It's just that now you owe me one, right? You have to go with something that maybe you're not super crazy about, but that I want. And what that is that's a really good way to make sure that everyone is the same amount unhappy, right, with what you're doing. And you might be mostly happy, but that's a corrosive thing to build on. The target is consensus. In other words, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the things where we agree, and we're going to let go of the things where we don't agree. Now, much easier said than done, right? And in the real world, almost everybody ends up compromising. So this is something to aspire to, and this is something where it's really important to be emotionally honest and to be have a spirit of generosity in what you're doing and know that the point of the collaboration is to discover something new, right? In other words, I have a studio here. I have a lot of instruments. I have a lot of skills. I can make music without other people if I want to, and sometimes I do want to, and that's a good thing. The point of collaborating is not for me to have that exact same experience just with other people doing things for me. So what we're shooting for is consensus. In other words, finding a shared vision, letting go of the things that aren't part of the shared vision, even though those things might be things you want to do, just know, oh, these are for me to do somewhere else. These are for me to do on my own, or these are things for me to do in a different collaboration. And so we're not letting go of them in a spirit of compromise. Again, okay, I'm not getting what I want, so you have to also not get what you want on something else. But we're doing that in the spirit of creating something that is truly shared and that is truly something that wouldn't occur if the collaboration wasn't happening. Okay, so the next piece is what I'm calling competence versus vision. And this is one that I know real well and that I've definitely struggled with at times. And so the situation is this, I've been playing guitar for many, many years, and I've played lots of different styles, certainly not every style by any means, but I know a lot of vocabulary for the instrument. So depending on, how the music is developing and sounding, I both have ideas of, oh, this kind of guitar part or that kind of guitar part or this kind of sound or that kind of sound, that's what's going to work. And then I can do it pretty good also. So I will tend to go into things just assuming because of that I know best and that I'm creatively the most qualified to make that decision. The thing that you learn over time, though, is that all of that competence, right, and that knowledge of what's come before and maybe some of that technical expertise also sometimes has the tendency to put your creativity in a box, right? In other words, you're basing parts on things you've heard before, or you're basing it on things you know that you're good at. Whereas sitting across from someone else who, let's say, coming up with guitar parts isn't their thing, right? But they are musical, that they're going to push you in a direction that, my initial thought might be, oh, no, that's wrong. What are you talking about? That's not a thing that guitar does or whatever. But of course, that can sometimes be the most vital thing, right? That can be the thing that gets you to get out of your, doing familiar things and to do something really cool and really original. And so that's another place where we can sort of fight with each other that doesn't necessarily end up serving the music. So especially when you're doing something that you're real good at, that's a great time to listen and just to not be so sure that means that you know best, right? Doesn't mean that you don't, but it also doesn't mean that you do. So let's talk a little bit about contribution, ownership, and credit, right? This is sometimes where things get really complicated. In a lot of ways, credit, I think, is the simplest one because in terms of giving people credit for their work or sharing credit for writing a song, it's generally speaking a really good policy to be really generous, right? Now, obviously, if you're into the thing of negotiating publishing splits and all that kind of stuff, that's almost a separate matter. There are a lot of different ways to do that. It's not my area of expertise. It's not really what I'm talking about. But sharing credit for creating something as a general rule is a good idea because it's always a bottomless pit to try to figure out exactly what amount any person contributed, except in the case of a very, very sandboxed collaboration, right? Otherwise, would things have turned out the way they did if you hadn't had, if you hadn't changed the keyboard part here, would you have changed the lyrics there? It gets really hard to figure that out. And I think being generous is generally the right approach. Now, contribution and ownership are related topics, but that are a little different. One of the things, I've definitely experienced and definitely seen are people getting into beefs about contribution. In other words, I'm putting more work into this than you are, and that leads to a few different places. Either that leads to a sense of, well, I'm working more, therefore I own it more and I have more say than you, which sometimes is true. Again, that's sometimes the reason to have a sandboxed collaboration. But of course, if something is really intended to be a 360, we're going to share the process, that's where things can get very messy there. And I think it's very important to own the amount that you want to work as you doing what you want to do, right? In other words, that doesn't necessarily give you a claim on anyone else's time, or it doesn't necessarily give you the ability to say, well, I'm doing this, therefore you should do this. That just generally seems to not work, right? So know yourself, know how much you like to work on something, know the kind of time you want to put in. And if you can't flow with somebody else's probably different approach to that, then you may not want to have that kind of 360 collaboration with them or with anyone. Except to the extent that you probably should try it at some point, because it's good for you to get all that stuff pushed on, and if you got to get uncomfortable or grumpy, you got to talk it out, you got to fight it out, just get back to hugging it out and move on and learn if that's the right situation for you or not. Ownership is a really interesting, tricky one, because in the case of a 360-degree collaboration, there can also sometimes be this feeling, something has gotten to that 65 or 75% point, and you're realizing that it's mostly not your ideas, or you don't remember them being your ideas. In other words, maybe you're doing a lot of playing the instruments or editing things in Ableton Live or Pro Tools, while the person you're collaborating with is just on a roll. And it's great to be with someone who's on a roll and to be hearing all these good ideas and getting into it, and the music's coming together and sounding great, right? But you get to that moment where you go, well, wait, what about me? What about what I'm putting into this? And is this a collaboration? And whether you're doing it consciously or not, there's some part of you that's thinking, well, I gotta get some of my business all up on this thing, so that it's on there and so that everybody can smell it. And that is, when I put it this way, I think it's pretty obvious that is never the way to go, right? I mean, Chris Rock in his recent special referred to it in a relationship as playing the tambourine. And there's no question that, I've always been someone who likes to have like a whole bunch of my stink on things. And I'm still working on it, I'm getting better at it, getting better at playing the tambourine, because if that's what's called for on the thing, that's what's called for on the thing, and do it. Okay, so as a final note to all this, while, I'm definitely speaking from a variety of personal experiences and a variety of, just talking to artists when I'm mixing something that they've collaborated on, and people just, sharing their experiences. So there are observations from a bunch of places, but there's no question that the one place where I've learned the most about this subject than anything else, my collaboration with April White called Tiny Machines. And we put out a record a year and a half ago now or whatever, that I'm really proud of, because I really feel like it's the first thing that I've ever done with someone that I know just would not have happened, would not have sounded the way that it did. If it wasn't for that collaboration, and if it wasn't for us, having all these moments of really coming together, in a sort of magical way to create something that was different than either one of us would have thought of by ourselves. And then also just being like hilariously, embarrassingly at each other's throats about things that literally we probably can't even remember what most of them are anymore. And there were definitely those moments of just, gotta hang in there and get to the other side of this because I know it's going to be something good. So I'm mentioning that if you enjoyed this video, please check out the Tiny Machines record. It's a self-titled full-length album, and I'm gonna put a link in the description to where you can hear it on Bandcamp. It's also basically on all the streaming platforms. You can just look us up on Spotify or whatever. And love to know what you think. So anyway, I hope some of this stuff has been helpful. Be in touch if you got any follow-up ideas or thoughts, and I will talk to you soon.